Hello again, and welcome to another edition of Media Watch. I'm your host, Eric Tait, and our co-host is, of course, the inimitable
Bob Anthony. Good to see you, Eric.
Bob. Glad to be with you again. And special guest for this particular program of Media Watch, folks, is Leroy Baylor.
Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. In the interest of full disclosure, folks, Leroy Baylor and I go back a long ways. So if I tell you we used to run track together in high school, that tells you how far back we go. but in his capacity as the co-host of the Communicators, we decided we needed to invite Leroy on because our topic for this particular show is going to be the media outlets that save and service our communities, hopefully save and service our communities, the fact that we seem to be losing them and we seem to be losing the voices that are willing to speak truth to power in this particular media arena.
And it seems to go across the whole media landscape, from print to electronic to radio to TV. We've seen a number of cases, and we're always on the watch for things when they change, not for the good.
Yeah, the interesting thing is we keep a continuing watch on the media. That's why the show is called Media Watch, because of a lot of different breaking news stories. What's normally a part of our usual agenda is not necessarily sidetracked, but has been put on the back burner so we could deal with some of those other pressing issues, like how poorly the Ebola story was being covered, how poorly the midterm elections was being covered. There's a whole lot of how poorly, isn't there? But in any event, one of the key things we want to look at basically is this a new wave of turning the clock back? So, Leroy, before we jump into the larger picture, you've been at it a while. What's your sense of the media landscape and what it's been like or is going to be like for people of color?
I believe that to give the black community a perspective, one has to look at the historical context in which we exist. And I feel that a review or researching on the part of people who have not done this is to get an idea of what the Reconstruction period was in America following the Civil War and following the advances that black people experienced after being freed from chattel slavery. Many of us did not know how to do for self, but there are so many towns and so many individual enterprises that open up throughout the course of the period before we were betrayed, the betrayal of 1877, 77, 76,
yes.
That we're dealing with this same kind of mindset that was always in existence in America as it relates to black people's role as they have seen it, as they have portrayed it in America. So when you have black people getting involved in media, that is an intrusion altogether. I worked for a media company, and when the blacks began to get promoted, Caucasians in the company had problems with the blacks being promoted, even though after blacks were promoted in that company, that blacks found themselves in departments where they were smarter than the people who wanted to keep them out. So when we talk about media and the pushback really is that from two standpoints. One, you don't belong there in the eyes of people who are about white supremacy. And the other one that's not talked about is the excellence of black men and women when they get into position. So what happens then is that they are fearful of our competition, our expertise competition. And I used to say I didn't get the job because I was black, until I realized that it's not about that. It's about our competitive edge, that we don't even come into the game looking to compete. But when we come into the game and work, we show them up because we do work and get results that they didn't get when they were in the position.
There's always that particular, it's not that you're not good enough, it's that you may be too good. So that's always been a problem. I remember when I was first coming into the industry, when I got out of the military, I was doing these interviews, and a good friend of mine was already working for CBS. And as I was making the rounds, he said, you have to be really careful because you're going to have people who are actually interviewing you for a position that if you get, you are going to be their competition. And so always be mindful of that fact as you deal with those kinds of interviews. So in the final analysis, we know that because of all those uprisings in the 60s,
yes,
there's no two ways about that. Because of those uprisings, folks call them riot, folks call them urban rebellions, whatever the nomenclature. When they did the survey and did the Kerner Commission report, it was just because it was basically an economic injustice, a social injustice, a criminal justice system injustice. Everything was an injustice, so that there was no doubt that there was need for some kind of venting. And so the two Americas, separate but unequal, one black, one white. I mean, the Kerner Commission just laid it out. And it laid out the media as well. People forget that part of the Kerner Commission report. They basically said, you folks in the media, y'all don't have a clue what's going on because you don't have anybody that look like these folk in your organizations. And so you know that was the impetus for us to come in. But of course, we had entrepreneurs who understood the impact of media. We had people like the Suttons and Hal Jackson, and people who would pool their resources, who would go into trying to get ownership. The Godfather himself came out of poverty, made sure he bought some radio stations and TV stations. So it's not that we don't understand the need for these things. And so what I like to look back on is the fact that we were wise enough and smart enough to know that's where we needed to be. And Bob, you can talk about your days in breaking into that color barrier out in the Midwest. What did you have to look out for? Where were we?
It's when I arrived at the Milwaukee Sentinel back in the 80s, it was they didn't have that many minorities on the staff to begin with. They only had one other black male, and of course I didn't know why I was hired. I just knew that I was. I found out years later that they had basically a hunt for additional minority reporters. Milwaukee wasn't that far removed from its own riots and its own local uprisings. It knew it needed more minority representation in the media. And as I progressed through different beats in the newspaper, I kept hitting the same glass ceiling. When I hit the level where I might qualify for this management type position or this choice job covering City Hall or the federal beat, it's like, no, we thought this other person was a better fit. One person said she didn't like my attitude. Now that's now we all hear that
The
in our
attitude,
careers.
yes.
That's the magic button. So that's part of what you and I and Eric, had to deal with at that point. Just battling our way through, either we broke the glass ceiling or we left. And in my case, I found something better and moved on.
Mm-hmm. Well, Leroy, circle back to the fact that within the context of us owning stations and or like within the smaller communities of these colleges and college stations, you then get situations where people of color are working at these stations. Some owned by us, some run by us, some eventually sold to people who don't look like us, but they're smart enough to make sure they still staff them with people like us and deal with issues pertaining to our community, because guess what? Those frequencies and those stations are licensed because they're the public airways, and so they're licensed with certain caveats saying you must deal with certain issues for that community that that frequency is supposed to service. So even within the ownership rules, there are FCC regulations that they have to live up to. To get back to that story that we were talking about before on in the New York greater metropolitan area, when you get to these commercial stations like WBLS, WLIB, formerly black owned, no longer black owned, WRKS, which used to be not black owned but black managed, black run, and was an organ outlet for a number of black talent and black community-based programs and syndicated programs run by people of color. So we had these outlets, and then they do a business deal, like, for example, the 98.7 KISS FM frequency, and it gets leased from MS Communications to Walt Disney, the Disney company. And what was a music primarily station with fairly decent public affairs programming gets transitioned to a 24/7 sports outlet so that it can go 24/7 sports. The interesting thing is they still have the requirement for maintaining public affairs programming. They still have a particular community that's licensed, that they are licensed to serve, and so they need to reflect that community.
And we've called them out on that a number of times. Of course, with a format change, we don't expect them to have the same type of programming they had before, with the notable radio hosts that would get into community issues. The station doesn't support that kind of format, but it does still have the requirement within its license to provide community information, information that the community can use beyond just pure sports reporting.
Yeah.
And we ended up, Eric and I, having last year's town hall meeting, and we've been in contact ever since with ESPN and Disney and the local people running the radio stations to remind them that this FCC requirement was still there. We saw progress at the beginning after the town hall meeting. It looked as if we had a good framework for the future where we would have community affairs broadcasting at decent hours during the day, a few minutes, but useful. And then we had the recent announcement.
And the interesting thing was the staffing was more reflective of the community. When they first came in after leasing, they actually had a black general manager. They had high-profile African-American talent on the station coming out of the #1 market. Basically, this is the most diverse market in the country, right? So you would think your station would reflect that diversity. I would want my station to reflect that diversity. And so it was very interesting that Stephen A. Smith, on-air talent, Bill Daughtry, on-air talent.
We had Bob Lohr as well in the audience.
At the town hall meeting.
Yes, yes.
But the bottom line was they had behind-the-scenes people in their staffing, in their management, the whole bit. But the guy who was running it, the black general manager, got promoted, David Roberts. And then once he got promoted, everything that they were doing just went down the tubes. And so that becomes problematical for us as an organization. I mean, even though I'm no longer a president of the New York Association of Black Journalists, I'm a former president. I founded their Media Watch committee, which is still in existence. This Media Watch show actually is an outgrowth of that. So those issues are still germane to us as working journalists and the organization that we formerly helped establish and run. And so we called it to their attention that they needed to do something about that. And we're actually waiting to hear back from them. It's going to be interesting to see what kind of response they've given us, because we have made it known to them that you can't just decide it because your black general manager has been promoted out. You're going to bring somebody in who's going to make an all white lineup for all your programming Monday through Friday. and your sales staff and your behind the scene managerial no longer reflects our community, that is just not acceptable. But it's part and parcel. When people think they can get away with something, they will try to get away with it. No, we've got no. I mean, I may still have some Disney shares, maybe, but the bottom line is that doesn't impact my decision on how they need to service our community, whether I own Disney shares or not. They need to be responsible to my community. So here, but the interesting thing, though, you're sitting in a position yourself from being within a contextual situation that deals with how voices that should represent our communities get silenced. And we want to segue from the commercial side to what happens when a community public station like WHCR, which is affiliated with the CUNY University system, correct, Leroy?
Harlem Community Radio, based at City College in Harlem, and coming out of a period when blacks in the community and students at City College were fighting for open enrollment. So it comes out of that period. It was not something that City College said, hey, it's there because, quote, we're in Harlem. It came out of pressure coming from the community and, quote, Harlem Community Radio. You're referring to the article, the interview that was done in the Amsterdam News with this headline. I'm always dealing with headlines because that's the best way I remember anything.
I hear you.
And even before I talk about my situation, the point about the ESPN and they're promoting the brother who was in the general managership outside of the company, he was kicked upstairs. Is the same thing that's happened to this brother Philip Banks.
They wanted to keep him upstairs.
Kicked upstairs
with no power.
No power.
Yes.
in this local area,
and
right?
what's not talked about is the policies that he had put in place and the people who he had put in place, and the fact that they no longer would have a backup with him.
Right.
And that is the situation now where they may not have backup, but it would be too obvious for the folks who run the New York City Police Department and wanted to have only a particular complexion at the top. It'd be too obvious for them to then move on these individuals in the light of his absence because it would expose the whole kit and caboodle. My situation at WHCR is one really that relates to the black community as opposed to me personally. As a co-host of the Communicators show, we were on for 27 years. And what we were always doing was bringing information, bringing edutainment to our people. It started out with a cadre of individuals who are part of the International Islamic Broadcasting Network. That's what the Communicators is a part of. When we are Muslims who are within the Nation of Islam, we are Muslims within the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood, and we're Muslims in various other sectors of Islam as it relates to black people in America. So the show has always been hosted by black Muslims, so use that term. Why does that matter? Because we come with a point of view that is strictly from a black point of view. We don't come from a colored point of view, a Negro point of view, a people of color point of view, a minority point of view. We come from a perspective that promotes black culture, that salutes black culture, and seeks to give information to black people. And we did that for 27 years, up until what surfaced in 2006 as an effort to remove us from the air on the pretext of anti-Semitism. On the pretext of anti-Semitism, and that came out of an interview that we did with a guy named John Kaminsky. We interviewed him based on his trip to Iran, and our interest in interviewing him on his trip to Iran is that they were beating the war drums for war against Iran, saying that the people of Iran didn't like American way of life and wanted to, the whole
we
stuff.
remember when there was a new drum beat after the first drum beat for the shock and awe on the Iraq war. then you're 2006 is about right. That's when the neoconservatives again started to beat the drum and said, oh no, the Iranian people, that's our worst nightmare. They're going to get the bomb, and if they get the bomb, we're in Armageddon and we must destroy them, so let's go to war. I remember that drum beat.
So
it hasn't died, by the way.
It hasn't died. So what is our role as communicators is to bring information across the board, or that balances out, or that is opposite what the party line is in the general media. You say, why would you do that? Because the party line, based on the analysis that has been done over and over again, is affected by individuals who are carefully placed within media to be the mouthpieces of a program that the general public is conditioned to buy into, etc.
We can attest to the fact that the majority of media, mainstream media, fell in line for the drumbeat for the Iraq War. Right. Media Watch was out here waving his hand and his flag saying, hold on, wait a minute, folk, you're not listening to what the real experts are telling you. I remember that. So I know where you're coming from about the fact that, yes, when they decide that they have bought the party line, whether deliberately, willingly, or not, then you're going to get one story.
But in terms of your show, there's never been an issue as to who you were, what your show was about, and who you would interview through your entire history. There was never, I mean, that focus that you've brought to the air has never changed. And it's not like you changed gears recently. You've always been the one to reach out for the other point of view, and so this should not have come as a surprise to anyone. Your interview either...
Oh, right. I mean,
this is
other sources. That's what you normally do.
This is what we do.
Right. That's what I mean. It should not have been a shock to anyone that your show would have done that.
No, it would. In fact, it would be, quote, an expectation. You know, who these guys going to have on this week in light of what's going on in the media. So we interviewed this guy, John Kaminsky. He was recommended to us by a member of the team. You know, say, all right. You know, what's the value of this guy? Well, he's been to Iran. We interview him, and we're talking about his experience in Iran. At the end of the show, we're signing off, and then he changes course and goes into this diatribe on Israel and the Jews, and I'm saying, what the hell, you know? I'm saying, wait a minute, you know? And this is like the 20 or 30 minute, not 20 or 30, 20 or 30 seconds at the end of the show. Right. And I'm signing off because the other people waiting to get in the studio, and I said, oh, okay. But that was it. So within a week and a half, this letter comes in. The station manager says, hey, you're being charged with anti-Semitism. I said, what? You know, she says, well, I got this letter. They're saying you're anti-Semitic, harboring. I said, wait a minute. This guy's at the end of the show. It's 20, 30 seconds, and I didn't have a chance to rebut what he was saying. I'm at the end of the show. And that ended up with us being suspended for 2 weeks. And because this charge of anti-Semitism, the show, which is on for 3 hours, in the last 20 or 30 seconds, is justification for tagging the show as anti-Semitic.
Quick, like, did they check the tape? Did they check the show?
Yeah. They heard. So the officials, the officials at City College, they heard it, they listened to it, but still, the Negro president at City College, a guy named Williams at that time, was mandating that our show be cut down because we are a 3-hour show. Our show be cut down because the longer we stayed on, the more likelihood we would get in. This is, you know, and
20 seconds at the end, but
this is a guy that runs a college and everybody respects. Okay. All right, fast forward to this year.
And we have about 4 minutes.
All right, June of this year, a packet comes in filled with Final Call newspapers, and they're marked up as being, this article here is anti-Semitic, this ad here is anti-Semitic, Minister Farrakhan is in there, he's anti-Semitic according to their stuff, and this is being promoted on the Communicators. Packet comes in with some transcripts. The garbage is garbage. Not in my opinion, it's garbage, but it's made to look like garbage because the professionals who do this want to appear as though they're just an average housekeeper and that sort of thing. This is not a whole bevy of letters. This is coming from a cell of individuals. Bottom line, a second packet comes in July, and I'm showing that packet in July 28th, called into a meeting on July 31st. The transcripts that I saw said that I mentioned Minister Farrakhan's name in the broadcast. Now, I'm interviewing, I'm 2-hour show, we cut down a 2-hour show.
Right.
I'm interviewing.
You lost an hour.
Okay. I'm interviewing across the board. I'm not interviewing Muslims. I'm interviewing, this is current events. I mentioned Minister Farrakhan's name. I mentioned the Final Call newspaper. And how did I mention the Final Call newspaper? Because I mentioned the obituary of Dr. Abdul Aleem Shabazz being in the Final Call newspaper, and that's my way of promoting the Final Call newspaper. And I mentioned that Professor Griff of Public Enemy is coming in. All of this is anti-Semitic.
In the group Public Enemy. Professor Griff.
Yes. Professor Griff.
So
I'm calling to a meeting on July 31st, and I'm told that the station manager tells me that she was told to cancel the show. She doesn't want to do it, but I got to cancel the show.
But you would, okay. It came down from above her.
It came down. Once again, I didn't make this clear, is that the cell of individuals would send the complaint to the head of CUNY. The head of CUNY would send
chancellor for the
chancellor.
university
That's where the
system.
complaint would go with CCs to city officials. Then it would go to, then it comes from his office down to the president of City College, and she in turn would send it to the station manager. The people who were sending in the complaint, Caucasian woman, totally disrespecting the black woman who runs the station. And that's what white supremacy is about. It's not about I don't trust you. It's about you shouldn't even be in this position, what we talked about earlier. That's the psych. So the bottom line is that I was told on July 31st that the show was canceled. Now, when media calls them, they'll say that I had unfair reporting, imbalanced shows, and that sort of thing. But the pretext of anti-Semitism is what has silenced this communication on WHCR. The people who hurt are the people who have brick and mortar.
So
radio.
Okay, so we have about 30 seconds.
You're
So we
going to have
need
to
to wrap.
migrate to another outlet.
Internet.
Yeah,
Go on
okay.
internet.
We'll start to look for you there.
And
we'll
please
be
let
back
us
on
know.
that.
Yeah,
Okay.
Please let us know.
We'll let people know because we're Media Watch. We tell people about all media. We aggregate stuff. We tell people where we aggregate from. I mean, if I were getting some info from Final Call, we'd be telling people.
Yes,
you need to look at
exactly.
the Final Call.
I'm Bob Anthony, and with Eric Tait, we've had.
See you the next time.
Yes.